the story came out that Sam Alito was flying, or Sam Alito's home was flying an American flag upside down on the flagpole in his yard. And, you know, he lives in Alexandria, Virginia, which is kind of a conservative enclave to begin with. But apparently one of his neighbors had an F Trump yard sign, which offended him. He went on Fox News and said that actually it was his wife, and blame it on the little woman, right? And that she was so upset about this because Alito said that the F Trump slogan was in the front yard of a house that was where the bus stop was for the school bus, and little kids were getting on and off the school bus and seeing this sign, and that just horrified his wife. So Steve Schmidt from the Lincoln Project called this out. He points out, you know, he said, here's the problem. There were no school buses and no school children on them in January of 2021 in Alexandria, Virginia. Schools in the city were closed for a full year as a result of the pandemic and didn't reopen until March of 2021. In other words, Alito was lying through his teeth on Fox News, obviously. But, I mean, that's what you expect. But now we discover that Alito's fingers were a whole hell of a lot deeper in this plot to overturn the election than anybody realized. Sidney Powell, who was Trump's attorney, in fact, one of Trump's lead attorneys in trying to overturn the results of the 2020 election, Sidney Powell, along with Louis Gohmert and Carrie Lake, excuse me, and a half a dozen other Republican operatives, had filed a lawsuit to block Mike Pence from counting the ballots, basically. The counting of the ballots is something that is provided for by the Electoral Count Act. But what they were saying was because there were multiple electors being submitted in a half a dozen states, in other words, the so-called fake electors, that this was like the election of 1876, where you had three states, two southern states and Oregon, that submitted two sets of electors, two sets of ballots to the Electoral College, and therefore the election got thrown to the House of Representatives. And so this lawsuit was to block Pence from counting the Electoral College votes because of the fake electors, and instead force it to the House of Representatives, where by a 27-23 vote, the House would have voted to put Donald Trump into the White House. And Sidney Powell, in this interview, in this television interview, she says, Justice Alito was our circuit court justice for this. In other words, they had made this appeal specifically to Alito. And Alito was supposed to rule on this. Now, the Trump gang, showing up at the Capitol building was supposed to postpone the counting of the vote. In other words, to prevent Mike Pence from counting the vote. And then the morning of January 7th, Alito was going to rule, or, according to this theory anyway, Alito was going to rule and say, we don't need to count the Electoral College votes. This should go to the House of Representatives because there's a dispute here. There are multiple Electoral College ballots that are in dispute. And had he done that, Donald Trump would have become president, and perfectly legally, because a Supreme Court justice, has the power, at least right now, to do that kind of thing. And Carrie Lake just came right out and said it. But here's where it gets really interesting. She goes on to say that Nancy Pelosi blew up the scheme, which is incredible. She says Nancy Pelosi had finagled, I'm quoting her here, I'm quoting Sidney Powell. Nancy Pelosi had finagled to file an amicus brief with our lawsuit. There had been inside goings-on in Congress where I believe it was Steve Scalise and Kevin McCarthy who kept her from being an actual party to the lawsuit, but she wanted to work herself inside the case as a party, but somehow that didn't happen. So she got notice when we made our filing because she'd filed an amicus brief. And then everything broke loose, and she really speeded up reconvening Congress to get the vote count going, or Bill Barr's Justice Department might have issued an injunction to stop it all, which is what should have happened, end quote. So in the end, on the morning of January 7th, Sam Alito could not make that ruling because Nancy Pelosi had reconvened Congress just 2 hours after the rioters left the building and held the vote. I mean, it didn't happen until the wee hours of the night, but it had happened. And so the next day, when it was supposed to go before Sam Alito as the head of that circuit, it didn't. It couldn't. Alito had to turn it down because it was a moot point at that point because Congress had already certified the election. So here's Alito in the middle of that. And, then you've got this other issue of Donald Trump right now would be a convicted criminal in Tanya Chutkan's court, in federal court, around January 6th, around his attempt to overthrow the government, if 4 Republicans on the Supreme Court had not granted cert to Lissated. I mean, they gave cert to the case on February 28th. They didn't hold their hearing until April 22nd. So, they gave Donald Trump a multi-month delay, and now they've added more delay to that. I mean, they don't have to issue a ruling until, well, they don't have to issue a ruling at all. I mean, they can sit on it for several years if they choose to. But, typically those rulings come out in June and July, but this might not come out until November, which means that Donald Trump never goes to trial. And again, who's at the middle of this? Who's at the core of this? Sam Alito, and in this case, Clarence Thomas. And Sam Alito's wife was apparently involved in this Operation Higher Court scheme. And Ginny Thomas, of course, was up to her eyeballs in January 6th, constantly texting to Mark Meadows that, we need to put them in Guantanamo and stuff like that. She wanted Biden to be arrested and put in Gitmo. Which raises a question. Why aren't Democrats doing something about this? I mean, Dick Durbin is the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and he issued this pathetic, mealy-mouthed, begging request to Alito saying, please recuse yourself, please, please, please. And Alito, of course, just ignored it. But let me tell you what happened in 1969. In 1969, Richard Nixon had just become president. He won in the 68 election. And the most liberal member of the Supreme Court was Abe Fortas. It was a 5-4 court, and Nixon wanted to flip the court to the right. And by the way, once he succeeded, it never went back. It's been controlled by Republicans ever since. So what Nixon and the Republicans in Congress did, Abe Fortas had defended a guy years earlier who couldn't pay him. And finally, after Fortas was appointed to the bench, this guy came up with $20,000 to pay Fortas. It was a late payment, but it was a payment for services. He also received a $15,000 payment from a publishing company for writing a book about the Supreme Court. And the Republicans alleged that his wife had some tax fraud information in a safe in her office. That was a complete lie. It was completely made up. But the other two things weren't even crimes. But nonetheless, John Mitchell, who worked for Nixon, he was the Attorney General, said he was going to convene a grand jury and drag Abe Fortas' wife before it. Congress, the Senate Judiciary Committee, was going to hold hearings, and they were going to drag Fortas and his wife before them. And the right-wing media, right across the board, was demanding he be impeached. And so finally, the heat got so intense that on May 14, 1969, Abe Fortas resigned just to stop the pressure, just to stop the pain. I'm saying Dick Durbin should learn from that lesson. He should be subpoenaing Thomas and Alito. He should be demanding their testimony. He should be enforcing those subpoenas. He should be requiring this. And members of Congress and Democrats right across the board, from Joe Biden all the way down to your local commentator in your local newspaper, should be demanding that these two men are impeached or resign. We need to do this. It's exactly what Republicans would do. And how do we know that? Because they did it in 1969 to a completely innocent guy. And in this case, Thomas and Alito are not completely innocent. I mean, Thomas has taken millions of dollars in bribes. And that's why he voted the way he did in Citizens United, apparently. Come on, Democrats, grow a spine. Come on, Dick Durbin, do the right thing.